For those of you who still don't know me, I am Julia Kolchinsky, Assistant Professor of English, focusing on creative writing and specifically poetry. It is my great honor to welcome poet, essayist, and scholar Jehanne Dubrow. And it is not an exaggeration to say that Jehanne has been integral to who I am as a poet, and perhaps even more so as a scholar of Holocaust literature. I first came across her work more than a decade ago. I had just finished my MFA, I was starting a PhD in comparative literature, and I discovered this incredible chapbook of poems that were all sonnets and villanelles written in conversation with Shulamit from Paul Celan's Death Fugue, which I know some of you have read and some of you will read, and all of you should read. And I had really never experienced such fusion between history, form, and personal story on the page. I knew I had to reach out to this poet to know her and learn from her. And I'm so lucky to have gotten to do so from that point forward. And while I literally wrote an entire dissertation chapter on Jehanne's work and can talk about it in great detail and length, that might put some of you to sleep. So I'll be kind and spare you this journey of me fangirling and gushing that has endured for, throughout the many poems and essays I've come to love by Jehanne. And instead, I'll invite junior creative writing major Elizabeth Keppen to share a more abridged introduction. And I chose Elizabeth because, like Jehanne's, Elizabeth's work has long impressed me with her gift to work within form and to bend it to her will. You should all ask her about her triumphant sestina. So give her a big round of applause.
Thank you. So when I first began writing poetry, I really hated form, actually. I avoided it at all costs. To me, it seemed archaic, dull, claustrophobic. On the whole, it just seemed like something I did not want to be a part of. It seemed like it was just zapping any kind of creativity I had. Then I started to actually read formal poetry and engage with it beyond just the Shakespearean sonnets I was forced to memorize in middle school. And among some of this formal poetry was the work of Jehanne Dubrow that really reignited my creativity and curiosity within form in poetry. Her work is evidence of the limitless nature that poetry provides in articulating what it means to be human in this world. In particular, Jehanne writes with a hand that is at once tender and unflinching, confronting the atrocities of war and the lingering ache of intergenerational trauma. Her work is simultaneously precise and compassionate, allowing beauty and brutality to coexist within the same carefully measured space. Her writing deftly invokes the senses, often pulling me in headfirst to a world I may not know anything about to begin with. From the first words to the last of every poem, I'm totally invested. Jehanne Dubrow is both a poet and creative nonfiction essayist, boasting 10 poetry collections, 3 essay collections with the 4th on the way, as well as a book on craft. Her work has appeared in Poetry, Southern Review, the New York Times Magazine, Alaska Quarterly Review, among others. On top of writing, Jehanne is also a distinguished research professor and professor of creative writing at the University of North Texas and the founding editor of Cherry Tree. Her writing has earned her numerous accolades, including the Adrienne Rich Award for Poetry, the Mississippi Review Prize in Poetry, a Sosslin Foundation Fellowship from the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and many, many others. Without further ado, it is my great privilege to welcome Jehanne Dubrow.
Thank you for those wonderful introductions. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a little worried about my voice. We couldn't figure out why I kept sniffling and sneezing, and then we realized I'd been sitting in front of a chalkboard for several hours, and I'm really allergic to chalk. So I've got cough drops, I've got water, and bear with me. So I'm really delighted to be here. I'm going to be reading from 3 poetry collections that form what I call my military spouse trilogy. The first book I started when I was completing my PhD. My husband was career Navy. We were recently married. And all of a sudden, it was the early 2000s. It looked like he was going to be deployed to either the Green Zone or into Afghanistan. And he was a naval officer. So this was extremely alarming to think about him in a combat zone. And so essentially I freaked out. And I started writing the poems that eventually became Stateside. As is the case, I think, often in military families, what we quickly discovered was after the initial worry that he was going to be sent someplace for which he was unqualified to serve, they canceled that billet and he was sent to a regular ship. But by that point, the poems in Stateside were well underway. So Stateside looks at the before, during, and after of a deployment. And I'm going to read a sonnet from the opening section. This is Against War Movies. I see my husband shooting in Platoon, and there he is again in MASH. How weird to hear him talk like Hawkeye Pierce. And soon I spot him everywhere, his body smeared with mud, his face bloodied. He's now the star of every ship blockade and battle scene. The Fighting 69th, A Bridge Too Far, Three Kings, Das Boot, and Stalag 17. In Stalingrad he's killed, and then he's killed in Midway and a few good men. He's burned or gassed, he's shot between the eyes, or shoots himself when he comes home again. Each movie is a training exercise, a scenario for how my husband dies. And the little story with that poem was that I wrote the first 12 lines in about an hour, and then I spent the next year trying to figure out how to end the poem. And I had gone to a poetry conference and the Swanee Writers Conference, and the faculty member who was sort of in charge of mentoring me was talking with me about this poem, and he said, well, why don't you think you can end that poem? And I said, well, I'm afraid if I write it, it will come true. And I think that revealed a kind of anxiety, but maybe belief that I also have, that poetry is a kind of spell making, and that not only does it describe the past, but sometimes it predicts the future. So in the aftermath of Stateside coming out, I read at civilian and military institutions around the country. And I was telling students earlier today that what I discovered was that in neither space did my poems please anyone. In civilian spaces, people were upset at me because they saw me as being part of the military-industrial complex and saw me as being complicit in war. And in military spaces, the officers, the service members, the family members saw me as disloyal, that it was considered unpatriotic for a military wife to say, hey, this is a really hard thing for a marriage to bear. And so I began to write poems that thought about what does it mean to be part of these two communities, the academic community and the military community that should be talking to one another, but they almost never do. And so that's how Dots and Dashes came to be. The title is partly a reference to Morse code, but it's also a reference to Emily Dickinson, who plays a little role in the book. We always think of Emily Dickinson as being in Amherst in her little room in her white dress, writing and writing, but she was also a poet of the world, and she was a poet who engaged with the Civil War, which occurred during her lifetime. So she's another sort of guiding spirit of this book. I'm going to read another sonnet. I promise they won't all be formal poems. So this poem is based on a real place that used to exist on the ground floor of the Pentagon. From the Pentagon. He brings me chocolate from the Pentagon. Dark chocolate shaped like tanks and fighter jets, milk chocolate tomahawks, a bonbon like a Kirsch grenade, mint chocolate bayonets. He brings me chocolate ships, a submarine descending in a chocolate sea, a drone unmanned and filled with hazelnut praline. He brings me cocoa powder, like chocolate blown to bits, or chocolate squares of pepper heat. Or if perhaps we fought, he brings a box of truffles home, missiles of semi-sweet dissolving on the tongue. He brings me Glocks and chocolate mines, a tiny transport plane, a bomb that looks delicious in its cellophane. I always thought it was so weird that there was this fancy Belgian chocolate shop in the Pentagon. And it was right next to a flower shop and a jewelry shop. And my husband once said, oh yeah, it's all the presents that a man will bring home to his wife when he thinks he needs to apologize. So one of the strange things about having writerly obsessions is that you are constantly telling yourself, I'm done with this topic now. And then inevitably your brain tells you, oh, no, no, you have more to write on this. So after Dots and Dashes came out, I said, I'm really done writing about my military marriage. I'm sick of talking about this. I write about a lot of things. I love writing about the census. I write extensively about Jewish history. I write about visual art. So I really thought, like, okay, I can move on to my other topics. But then 20 years into his service, my husband decided that he was finally done, that he was sick of serving and he wanted another life. And at first, I didn't think that this would touch my writing at all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that he was about to undergo a radical transformation, personally, professionally, physically, even. And I thought, oh, he's giving up a life of uniforms and uniformity. So I started to think about, well, what is a civilian? And I told students a little bit about this earlier. Like many poets, the first thing I do when I'm thinking about a project is I start research, and I start looking at things like the dictionary and etymology. So I went and looked up the definition of the word civilian. And the definition is someone who is not a combatant. And I thought, oh, that's very strange. It's a role defined by negation, what you are not. And I thought, how much in opposition to military life is that? Where, when you're in the service, every part of your day is defined. You know exactly what you're going to wear. You know what time you have to be at your next meeting. Everything is mapped out for you. And now he was going to be a civilian. And so I started wondering what literature I could look at. With Stateside, I had looked extensively at the Iliad, but especially at the Odyssey, because the figure of Penelope became a role model for me of what the military life can look like in literature. With Dots and Dashes, I looked at Sappho, I looked at Emily Dickinson, I was interested in women's voices regarding war. And so I kept thinking, well, what is the literature of the veteran? And there's very little of it, frankly. And that's because the veteran is a difficult, complicated, and often unsexy figure, unlike the soldier, right? The soldier is easily turned into mythology and heroism. The veteran, even if he hasn't seen combat, will often come back different than he was before. And so then I had to think more metaphorically. Okay, transformation. And that's what took me to Ovid and his Metamorphoses, because I started thinking, well, maybe becoming a civilian is as radical a change as being turned into a laurel tree or a spring of fresh water or a dolphin. And so I reread Ovid's Metamorphoses, which I hadn't read since I was in college. My husband and I actually fell in love while we were reading Ovid as undergrads. And so it seemed natural that Ovid would become part of the book as well. So you'll hear some Roman references in these poems, some ancient Greek references in them, and I'll try my best where necessary to explain them. So this opening poem is called What Do You Give the War That Has Everything? The first year, we were told, is always the most difficult, a neutral zone of afternoons and nights. Dear war, we said, we are sending ourselves folded inside gilded envelopes. We have stamped your name in wax. By the second year, we'd learned to rip the bed sheets into strips for bandages. This is the gift of cotton, we said, that it soaks whatever seeps. Soon there was leather, soon there was linen, the wood we burned when supplies were cut to the front. And later, there was iron melted, red, and molded into spears, the fruit shape of grenades. In the seventh year, we gave the war a heavy blanket made of wool. Never mind, we said, the smell of other bodies in the folds. We forgot the year of bronze. Year 9, we offered up the decorative, a piece of pottery painted with a chariot, a dead king dragging through the dirt. The war broke our presents into shards. After that were years of tin and steel, the tear of silk, like a flag the horses trample on, then lace, as with the tender bodice of a girl. In the 14th year, there was ivory, because why not pull down the giants of the world? And next, a crystal cup for drinking victory, a porcelain plate to serve a traitor's head. In year 25, we engraved the war on silver. This is costing us too much, we said. We barely counted then the years of pearl and coral, the ruby like a puncture wound, the poison blue of sapphire set in gold. The war took anything we had to give. Decades on, we gave emeralds for the green of some forgotten field. We gave the war a diamond to honor its cleave and glittering, its dreadful way of capturing the light. And so when I was writing that poem, I went to the Hallmark website and I looked up all the traditional anniversary gifts for every anniversary year. And that's how I wrote the poem was, oh, this year is associated with paper. Oh, this year is associated with cotton, and so on. So you can often find poems in very surprising locations. There are a number of poems in the book that are just called civilian, and this is my effort in these poems to try to define what is a civilian, what does it look like. So this is a villanelle, civilian. I bring the war into my bed each night and let it press metallic to my cheek. I barely move beneath the trembling light that it emits, a semaphore both bright and shadowy, its messages oblique. I bring a war into my bed. Each night it floats across the sheets toward me, despite the little swells of fear I never speak. I barely move beneath the trembling light, the bite of sea salt on my lips, the slight, unnerving sound of waves the anchors creak. I bring his war into my bed each night, anticipate its sonar ping, invite its touch. I know the heat its missiles seek. I barely move. Beneath the trembling light, I am a target in the line of sight. I am a shore toward which the cruisers streak. I bring our war into my bed each night and barely move beneath its trembling light. And if you were thinking, boy, that poem is really repetitive, that's part of the form, is to repeat these interlocking lines along with a very complicated rhyme scheme. So somebody asked me about this poem during my trip here, so I thought I would read it. It's called When Diplomacy Married War. I was posted to partitioned cities, to countries split by the long invasion of history. I was trained to be tactful, even toward the tanks, touched my fingers to their protruding noses, as is the custom in such places. Perhaps it's surprising I found romance then. War marching to the gates of the embassy. It sat at the endless table in the gilded room of negotiation. War had big shoulders and barely fit the crushed suit it wore. But still, I admired the drumming of its voice. Its mind had an asymmetric beauty, sea blue and crisp in its skill at flattening a town with the clustered munitions of its thoughts. Now we are married, and I concede I keep attempting a détente between us. I offer caviar as an overture to peace, slugs of vodka. I argue for a wheat field left alone. Don't trample through the barley, I tell my war. Often we agree on nothing but the bedroom, our only zone of safe passage. If only I could persuade it to foxhole in the blankets, to nuzzle in the rubble. If only I could stroke it into sleep. So in some ways that seems like a poem entirely about metaphor, but my parents were diplomats and I was raised in embassies all over the world. And I was trained in diplomacy and in those cold, chilly rooms where diplomatic negotiations happen. So I've always thought it was strange that I married somebody who became a naval officer. This is a brief history of war. It's called Epic War Poem. What else but a soldier raging by his shield? What else but the dutiful? What else but a battle muraled on a wall, and Troy a piece of artifice we gaze upon? What else but the voice, a garment shredded in its grief? What else but ash? What else but men on wooden ships for centuries? Their keening is an arrow to the throat. What else but kings? What else but the trebuchet of years? What else but sawbuck fences leaning near a field? What else but America? What else but daguerreotypes, a line of corpses posed within the frame? What else but the guns? What else but the trenches stuck with mud? What else but modernity and the long parade of after? What else but cinders mixed with milk while the scorched are drifting, processed into smoke? What else but the skirmishes of scholars, language too little and too much? What else but brief eras of indifference when the dead are left alone? What else but the forged and hammered thing of poetry, all the failures of our making? What else but the litany of bombs? So the middle section of the book is a retelling of Ovid's Metamorphoses in 15 parts. For those of you who perhaps like Roman literature, maybe you'll check it out later. I'm going to read some poems from the end of the book, and this is the point in the marriage where the husband has retired and these two people are really trying to figure out what on earth does this mean for us. So a couple of students asked me about this poem earlier today. A hail and farewell in military circles is an event where you say goodbye to an officer who's leaving a billet and you welcome his replacement in. But the term hail and farewell comes from a poem by Catullus. And I've always thought it was funny that soldiers have no idea that this very common military event is deeply linked to poetry. So this is hail and farewell. When it's over, he wants to leave without glasses raised together at his going, no last salute or sir. I admit to gratitude, I've never stood at ease in the uniform stillness of those wives, dependents as they're known, the watered silk of their voices at a ball, or the brides who bend beneath an arch of sabers. Although I understand the day must be lowered ceremoniously, received into our hands. I understand we fold these endings with neat and pointed corners. Some parties welcome new arrivals to command. Some parties are for parting. They take their names from poems of the dead. I'm glad he takes nothing with him when it's over. Not the flowers, not the picture of a little ship, how it floats forever in the matte black frame of war. And they always give you a parting gift like that. It's like a ship in an ugly black frame with everybody signing their names. And you know the guy goes home and immediately throws it in the trash. There are a lot of sonnets in these three books where I'm writing about little objects of war and the stories that they contain. So this is one of those poems. It's called Trench Whistle. I call my dogs with it, a blast of sound that summons them from far across the grass. And they come running at the trill, each hound a blur of lead-gray fur, a yipping mass. They only know the pleasures of the lawn, the clovered fragrances. This cry I make is like a strident bird that's quickly gone, the branch now bare, the air that seems to shake with what was there before. They can't conceive this whistle mobilized whole companies of men. Its voice was sharp enough to cleave the clamor of the front, the batteries of mortar rounds. I call, and each dog runs, unhunted by the terror of the guns. And it's true, I do have a little trench whistle at home, and I've used it to summon my dog, and it makes a terrible sound. You can imagine how in the First World War it cut through that deafening clamor of the front. So this next poem is what gave the cover its bright purple cover. Tyrian purple was the original purple for royalty, and it was derived by basically boiling mollusks. And it's incredibly durable. They have many ancient pieces of cloth that still have this purple color in them. So I wanted to think about this purple and what it means to make art adjacent to terror. So this is called Tyrian purple. Please understand, to heave Hector through the dirt, Achilles must first cut holes in his enemy's heels. Hector threaded like a needle with leather cord and tied to a chariot that will pull him around the walls. Imagine a body strong enough to be strung like this. Imagine such stitching is an art, and we call it battle. Andromache, deep in the palace, is weaving a cloak on a wide loom. Wool like the amethyst shadows beneath her eyes, that vivid sleeplessness. She's tacking flowers to the fabric when she hears the weeping everywhere in Troy. The bobbin unspools from her fingers because the warp is a place of order and death the cutting shears. Who can blame Andromache as she sits at the loom for hours, rectangular world where nothing extends beyond the cloth's perimeter? At this point in the war, everyone has lost the thread of narrative, any reason past armor and the carrion birds with their beaks like sharpened secateurs. Who wouldn't want to take up some craft, pottery perhaps, or painted funerary stones when the city is besieged? Dote hands need occupation. Probably a reader believes it frivolous. These fibers dyed the plum of galaxies, all that great oppressive sky, and the murdered looking down from their fixed constellations. Even a wife must find a pastime. It's late in our history to condemn the way people spin out a war, if they twist the days like fibers on a spindle. Imperial purple, purple of bruised loyalties, unfadable purple that stains the maker's skin. So in that poem, I'm thinking about how have my fingers been stained by this long contact with war. And the poem that comes right after it is about that myth that maybe some of you know, Pygmalion and Galatea. And usually we sort of envision, especially that very famous romantic painting where the painter is bringing her to life, bringing the sculpture to life. And I wanted to reverse the story. So this is Pygmalion and Galatea. You could say that for decades, I have carved him into life. First heat overtaking the ivory chill of his torso, then the rest down to his bruised arches. I am like the sculptor who loves the chisel's edge and the hammer that splits a tusk in two, any tool that requires inquisitive hands. I keep chipping away to find his body. According to the old story, I should be naked on the plinth, bent slightly back to accept the artist's kiss. But I prefer reversals. In this version of the myth, I etch his face with a beard and a tired groove in his forehead. I add a map of scars to his palm. No doubt, it's easier to lift the mallet than to be the one hewn from bone. There is the knock of being seen. Another's gaze can split the self like a wedge. You could say, we're both a little weary now. He's ready to climb down from the pedestal, recover feeling in his legs, and I have breathed the scattered dust of him for years. So I think I'll just read 2 more poems. I was telling one of the classes earlier that I wrote this poem after I received a really negative response about an early version of the manuscript in which the reader said that my poems were unfeminist and pro-war, which I thought was like a gross misreading of the intent of the work, and it pissed me off. And I often write good poems, I think, when I'm really mad. And so this poem is directed to that reader. It's called Domestic Policy. Today, I didn't say divorce because I was sickened by the news from Afghanistan. Translators and their families left waiting at the gates while American personnel lifted off in the wide indifference of their transport planes. I said divorce because I hadn't made space in the cabinet for my husband's things, and he was angry I did not leave a vacancy for what he carried home from war. I was tired of him stacking bowls on the top rack of the dishwasher, a policy I can't abide when the lower rack is an open country waiting to be washed clean. Forgive me, reader, for the weakness of my marriage. I didn't say divorce because my husband would rather a drone hover above a wedding procession, the party far below, embroidered dresses glinting, small mirrors sewn into the hems. He prefers a pilot fire from a distant, unendangered screen, and I believe killing should come with the risk of dying for the killers. But that's not why I said divorce. Forgive me, reader, for the poems of closets and kitchens. Marriage is not two ideologies fighting at a table while the soup goes cold on a spoon. Marriage is two people fighting about spices, the ordering of jars by alphabet or continent, as if everything depends on an ounce of turmeric fading under glass. Perhaps I said divorce for all the wrong reasons. Forgive me for scrubbing the pot with a bristled brush. My fury at the gold-stained enamel is almost the same size as my rage that somewhere a helicopter strikes on civilians tonight. Forgive my sentiment. All I can do is keep scraping the dried burning from the pan. And I'm going to end with a final civilian poem. Civilian. These days, I'm mostly grateful he's one of us, no longer a piece of metal stamped with his name, identifying facts. He no longer jangles the click of steel to steel, no more in service to a ship or the gray machinery of the state. Now when we touch, I can feel his edge worn down and barely miss the keenness of his mouth. I remember for decades he wore two tags around his neck, one to leave with the body, the other perhaps brought back to my hands. Thank you.